The very messed up origins of Napoleon Hill. You think Napoleon Hill discovered the secret to wealth and success? The man who taught millions how to think and grow rich. The founding father of the entire self-help industry. The guru whose book sold over 100 million copies worldwide and inspired everyone from Tony Robbins to the creators of The Secret. But what if I told you that the man who claimed to unlock the formula for prosperity died nearly broke? Was married 5 times with multiple wives filing for divorce, citing violence and infidelity. Ran from fraud charges across 3 states. Was involved in a cult that tried to raise an immortal baby. And that historians have proven his most famous claim, his mentorship by billionaire Andrew Carnegie, never actually happened. This is the story they conveniently left out of the motivational seminars. In 1937, while America clawed its way out of the Great Depression, a book hit shelves that promised desperate people a guaranteed path to riches. Think and Grow Rich became an instant sensation. The author, Napoleon Hill, claimed he had spent 25 years interviewing over 500 of America's wealthiest men, distilling their secrets into 13 principles that anyone could follow to achieve unlimited success. He said Andrew Carnegie himself had personally chosen him for this sacred mission back in 1908, giving him letters of introduction to titans like Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and John D. Rockefeller. The only problem? None of it was true. Researchers who spent years combing through Carnegie's personal archives, his daily schedules, his correspondence, his diaries found absolutely nothing. No meetings, no letters, no commission. Carnegie's own secretaries kept meticulous records of every visitor. Napoleon Hill's name appears exactly 0 times. The billionaire mentor who supposedly launched Hill's career never knew he existed. But the fabricated origin story was just the beginning of Hill's deceptions. Before he ever wrote a word about success, he was already running scams. In 1907, in Mobile, Alabama, his lumber company defrauded suppliers out of tens of thousands of dollars by ordering lumber on credit from as far away as Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, then selling it for cash at drastically below market prices and pocketing the money. When creditors came looking, Hill had already vanished. By 1908, he'd fled to Washington, D.C., and reinvented himself, even dropping his first name Oliver to escape his past. He opened the Automobile College of Washington, which Motor World magazine called a joke to anyone of average intelligence. Students paid tuition to learn automotive engineering, but were actually used as unpaid labor to assemble cars. When the supplier went bankrupt in 1912, the students never received the wages they'd been promised. Hill simply closed the doors and moved to his next scheme. Then came the wives. 5 of them. And the pattern was always the same. Meet a woman from a wealthy family. Marry her quickly. Drain her resources to fund his failing ventures. Cheat openly. And when she finally filed for divorce, he'd disappear to another city with another name and another plan. But this story gets darker than financial fraud and serial infidelity. Because the secrets Napoleon Hill was hiding weren't just about money. They were about violence, about manipulation, about lives destroyed in the wake of his relentless self-promotion, and about questions that remain unanswered to this day. The Carnegie story wasn't just a harmless exaggeration for marketing purposes. It was the foundation of everything. Hill claimed that in 1908, when he was a struggling young reporter, he'd been sent to interview the legendary steel magnate at his mansion in New York. According to Hill's version, Carnegie was so impressed by his questions that he spent 3 days revealing the secrets of success, then commissioned him on the spot to spend the next 20 years interviewing America's greatest achievers to create a comprehensive philosophy of success. Hill said Carnegie gave him letters of introduction, opened doors to Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, and told him this mission would require him to work without payment for 2 decades. It was a beautiful story. Inspiring, the kind of origin myth that gives a self-help guru credibility. The kind of story you tell when you need people to trust you, despite having no actual credentials, no formal education beyond high school, and a criminal record you're trying to outrun. Researchers have spent years trying to verify this meeting. They've examined Carnegie's meticulously kept appointment books, his personal correspondence that fills entire archives, his secretary's daily logs that recorded every single visitor to his office and home, and the schedules maintained by the Carnegie Corporation. They found meetings with presidents, inventors, fellow industrialists, journalists, and hundreds of other documented visitors. Pause. Napoleon Hill's name appears nowhere. Not once. Not in any document, any letter, any diary entry, any mention in Carnegie's private papers. The meeting that Hill claimed changed his entire life and gave birth to the self-help industry never happened. Carnegie died in 1919, conveniently unable to confirm or deny Hill's claims. Hill didn't publish his first major book until 1928, 9 years after Carnegie's death, when there was no one left to call him a liar. But even if the Carnegie story had been true, Hill's early life reveals a pattern that makes his later teachings on integrity and character deeply ironic. In 1910, at age 27, he placed a personal advertisement in a Washington, D.C. newspaper seeking a young lady for mutual friendship, with the possibility of leading to matrimony. A woman responded, but when Hill arrived at her house, it was her cousin who caught his attention. Florence Elizabeth Horner was still in high school, barely 18 years old, but she came from a prominent and wealthy family in West Virginia. Hill married her within months. Florence's family, seeing potential in the ambitious young man, invested substantial money into his ventures. The Automobile College of Washington, that later collapsed in fraud, funded largely by Florence's family. The George Washington Institute of Advertising, that Illinois issued arrest warrants for. Florence's money, every failed scheme, every fraudulent business, every promise that evaporated. Florence's family money paid for it all, while Hill assured them success was just around the corner. Their first son, James, was born in 1911. Napoleon Blair arrived in 1912. David was born in 1918. Hill postponed their honeymoon until 1999, years after the wedding, because he was always too busy with the next business venture, the next opportunity, the next scheme that was definitely going to work this time. Then in 1912, despite having a wife and 2 infant sons who depended on him, Hill made a decision that reveals everything about his character. He moved to Chicago to pursue yet another business opportunity, leaving Florence and the children behind in West Virginia with her family. He sent almost no money, no child support, no financial help. He simply disappeared into his endless cycle of failed ventures and reinventions, starting businesses in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York. Always one step ahead of creditors and authorities, always promising Florence he'd send for her soon, always lying. Court records from Florence's eventual divorce filing in 1935 paint a devastating picture: abandonment, serial infidelity, financial irresponsibility. A husband who spent decades preaching about the importance of definiteness, of purpose, and personal responsibility, while refusing to support his own children. But Florence was just the beginning of a pattern. Hill had already perfected his formula with an earlier wife, and he would repeat it again with the women who came after Florence. Meet a woman with money or family resources. Marry quickly. Extract everything he could. Disappear when things fell apart. And through it all, he was writing articles and giving speeches about character and integrity, and the principles of lasting success. By the early 1930s, Hill had become a ghost in his own family's life. Florence and their 3 sons rarely heard from him. He was bouncing between cities, lecturing on success while dodging creditors and arrest warrants from his previous fraudulent ventures. Then, in 1935, Florence finally filed for divorce after 25 years of abandonment and broken promises. The court documents reveal a marriage that existed only on paper for over 2 decades. A husband who contributed nothing while building his reputation as a success philosopher. But just months after his divorce from Florence was finalized, Hill was already planning his next marriage. In 1936, he married Rosalie Bielant, and this is where the story takes a turn into territory that even Hill's most devoted followers struggle to explain. Rosalie came from money, which by now should surprise no one familiar with Hill's pattern. But Rosalie was different from Florence in one crucial way. She was a true believer in Hill's philosophy. She didn't just fund his projects, she became his collaborator, his editor, his partner in promoting the ideas that would eventually become Think and Grow Rich. In fact, historians credit Rosalie with being instrumental in actually getting the manuscript completed and published in 1937. While Hill had spent years talking about his research and his principles, it was Rosalie who pushed him to finish the book, who helped organize his scattered writings into something coherent, who used her connections and resources to find a publisher. The book that would make Hill famous was as much her creation as his, though her name appears nowhere on the cover. Think and Grow Rich was published in 1937 and became an immediate bestseller during the Great Depression. Desperate Americans looking for any path out of poverty bought the book in massive numbers. The 13 principles Hill outlined, the promises of wealth through positive thinking, the guarantee that anyone could achieve riches if they just believed hard enough. All of it resonated with a country in crisis. Hill finally had the success he'd been chasing for 3 decades. He bought a Rolls-Royce. He purchased 600 acres of land in the Catskill Mountains of New York. He lived the lifestyle he'd always promised was waiting just around the corner. But wealth didn't change his fundamental nature. It just gave him more resources to pursue increasingly bizarre ventures. In the late 1930s, Hill and Rosa Lee became deeply involved with a group called the Royal Fraternity of the Master Metaphysicians, a cult based on Long Island that used Think and Grow Rich as essentially a religious text. The cult's leader, James Bernard Schaefer, preached that diseases were caused by negative emotions, and that a person surrounded only by positivity and eating the right foods would never get sick and could potentially live forever. In 1939, the cult took this belief to its logical extreme. They unofficially adopted a newborn baby named Jean Gaunt and announced they would raise her in a completely positive environment with no exposure to negativity, illness, or death. They called her the immortal baby. Jean would have personal nurses who were forbidden from ever speaking about disease or death in her presence. No unkind words would ever be spoken around her. She would eat only vegetarian foods. And Napoleon Hill, the famous author and success philosopher, became the baby's godfather. The experiment, if you can call it that, lasted about 2 years before authorities intervened and returned Jean to her biological mother in 1941. The following year, Schaefer was arrested and convicted on fraud charges related to the cult's activities. During his trial, Schaefer claimed that Hill had been the one who inspired and encouraged the immortal baby experiment. Using Hill's teachings about the power of thought and environment to justify the cult's practices. Whether Hill was a true believer in the cult's extreme interpretations of his philosophy, or whether he simply saw an opportunity to surround himself with wealthy followers who treated him like a prophet, is unclear. What is documented is that he was deeply involved, attending meetings, giving lectures to members, and lending his name and credibility to their activities until the entire thing collapsed in scandal. Around 1940, Hill and Rosa Lee divorced. The details of their separation reveal another pattern. Despite the fact that Rosa Lee had been instrumental in completing and publishing Think and Grow Rich. Despite her years of support and collaboration, Hill had been unfaithful throughout their marriage. Court records mention suspicions of infidelity as grounds for divorce. But here's what makes this divorce particularly significant. As part of the settlement, Rosa Lee received all the royalties from Think and Grow Rich, the book that would continue selling for decades. Hill walked away from his greatest commercial success with nothing. Rosa Lee, showing perhaps more business acumen than her ex-husband ever possessed, married her divorce lawyer shortly after the divorce was finalized. She would later write her own self-help book with a rather pointed title, How to Attract Men and Money. Hill, meanwhile, was once again nearly broke, despite having written one of the best-selling books in American history. By the early 1940s, Napoleon Hill was in his late 50s, divorced for the 4th time, entangled in a cult scandal, and watching his ex-wife profit from the book he'd built his reputation on. He'd spent decades teaching people how to think and grow rich, while repeatedly losing everything he gained. He'd abandoned his children, abused his wives according to court testimony, defrauded business partners across multiple states, and associated with groups that believed positive thinking could create immortal babies. Yet somehow, his reputation as a success guru not only survived but continued to grow. The book kept selling. People kept buying into the promise, and Hill, ever the reinvention artist, was already planning his next move, his next marriage, his next opportunity to sell the dream of success, while his own life remained a cycle of fraud and failure. In 1943, at age 60, Napoleon Hill married for the 5th and final time. Annie Lou Norman was 47 years old when they met. She owned a boarding house where Hill was renting a room, and their friendship developed into marriage. Annie Lou would remain with Hill until his death, making her the only wife who stayed. But by the time they married, the most successful period of Hill's career was already behind him, and the contradictions between his teachings and his life were becoming impossible to ignore. Here was a man who had just published a book guaranteeing wealth through the power of thought. Yet he'd declared bankruptcy multiple times, lost every business he'd ever started, and was living in a rented room at age 60. The irony was lost on neither his critics, nor, one suspects, on Hill himself. But the deeper anyone looked into Think and Grow Rich, the more troubling questions emerged. Hill claimed he'd spent 25 years interviewing over 500 of the most successful people in America to distill their common principles. He named names constantly throughout the book, referencing conversations with Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and dozens of other luminaries. The problem is that there's no evidence any of these interviews actually happened. Researchers have found no appointments in these men's schedules, no correspondence, no mention in their papers, no payment records, nothing. Edison's archived materials contain no record of meeting Hill. Ford's meticulously documented life shows no interaction with him. The presidential libraries have no evidence of Hill advising Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt, despite Hill's repeated claims that he helped craft Wilson's League of Nations speeches and inspired Roosevelt's famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." These weren't minor exaggerations. They were the foundation of his authority, the proof that his principles worked because they came directly from the most successful people alive. Without those interviews, the book becomes something very different. It becomes the speculation of a man who'd failed at nearly everything he'd attempted, presenting his theories as documented fact. The content of the book itself raises even more questions about originality. Wallace Wattles had published The Science of Getting Rich in 1910, nearly 3 decades before Hill's book, outlining remarkably similar principles about the power of thought and visualization. The New Thought movement had been teaching these concepts since the late 1800s. Hill's contribution was NT, discovering these ideas but repackaging them with the false authority of having learned them from Carnegie and other titans of industry. He took existing philosophical concepts, added fabricated interviews and statistics, and presented it all as groundbreaking research. And it worked. The book sold millions of copies. But Hill himself remained perpetually broke, which should have been the biggest red flag of all. A man teaching the guaranteed formula for wealth couldn't maintain his own financial stability. He declared bankruptcy in 1933, 1946, and 1952. He was evicted from properties for unpaid rent. He borrowed money from followers and rarely paid it back. W. Clement Stone, the insurance magnate who credited Hill's book with inspiring his fortune, eventually partnered with Hill in 1952 to sell success courses. But even Stone's considerable resources and genuine business success could uncompensate for Hill's pattern of mismanagement and grandiose schemes that collapsed. What's perhaps most revealing about Hill's character is how he systematically erased the women who made his success possible from the narrative he told about himself. In his lectures and writings, Hill presented himself as a self-made man who pulled himself up from poverty through sheer determination and positive thinking. He rarely mentioned Florence, the wealthy teenager whose family funded his early ventures for over 2 decades. He omitted Rosalie's crucial role in completing and publishing Think and Grow Rich, the book that made him famous. In Hill's version of his own story, he was always the lone genius, the tireless researcher, the man who succeeded despite obstacles. Never the serial husband who married for money, used women's resources to fund failing businesses, and abandoned his own children to chase the next scheme. His son Napoleon Blair tried to maintain a relationship with his father over the years. But Hill's letters to his children were sporadic at best, often going years between contact. He wrote volumes about the importance of family and personal relationships, while having virtually no relationship with his own sons. By the 1960s, Hill was in his 80s, still trying to sell courses on success, still partnering with various promoters and publishers, still making grand claims about his influence and his discoveries. He'd suffered a stroke in 1962 that left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak, though he recovered enough to continue working. In 1966, he and Annie Lou moved to South Carolina, where his health continued to deteriorate. He died on November 8, 1970, at age 80. His net worth was estimated at about $1 million, which sounds substantial until you realize his book had sold over 15 million copies by that point. The vast majority of the wealth generated by Think and Grow Rich went to his ex-wife, Rosa Lee, and to the publishers. The man who taught the world how to think and grow rich died comfortable but far from the vast fortune his teachings promised. His foundation would continue selling his books and courses, building an empire on his teachings long after his death. But Hill himself never achieved the lasting wealth and success that he guaranteed to everyone else. The guru died still chasing the dream he'd been selling for 50 years. The Napoleon Hill Foundation continues to operate today, decades after his death, promoting his teachings and selling his books to new generations. Think and Grow Rich has now sold over 100 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling books in history. The concepts Hill popularized, whether he invented them or simply repackaged them from earlier sources, have become foundational to the modern self-help industry. Every motivational speaker who talks about visualization, every business guru who preaches the power of positive thinking, every success coach who promises that belief alone can transform your reality. They're all following the blueprint Napoleon Hill created. Tony Robbins built a multi-million-dollar empire on principles that trace directly back to Hill's work. The creators of The Secret, in 2006, essentially plagiarized Hill's 1937 book, almost word for word, repackaging his law of attraction for a new century. Grant Cardone, Tai Lopez, and countless others who sell courses and seminars on success and wealth are selling variations of what Hill taught. The industry he helped create is now worth billions of dollars annually, all built on the foundation of a man whose own life was a cycle of fraud, failure, and broken promises. Which raises an uncomfortable question that his followers rarely want to address. If everything about Hill's credentials was fabricated, if the interviews never happened, if the research was invented, if he plagiarized from earlier sources, if his own life demonstrated repeated failure at nearly everything except selling books about success, why does the material still resonate with so many people? The cynical answer is that people desperately want to believe in shortcuts to success, in simple formulas that guarantee wealth, in the idea that thinking the right thoughts can overcome structural inequality, lack of opportunity, or plain bad luck. Hill's genius wasn't in discovering truths about success, but in understanding what people wanted to hear and packaging it in a way that felt authoritative and achievable. He told people that they didn't need education, connections, capital, or even good fortune. They just needed to believe strongly enough. It's a seductive message, especially for those who lack traditional advantages. And for some people, the placebo effect of that belief genuinely does create positive change. Confidence can open doors. Persistence can overcome obstacles. Positive thinking can improve mental health and decision-making. The fact that Hill was a fraud doesn't necessarily make every principle in his book worthless. But it does mean we should question why we're retaking life advice from a man who abandoned his children, allegedly abused his wives, according to court testimony, defrauded countless business partners, and died having achieved only a fraction of the wealth he promised to others. The real tragedy of Napoleon Hill's story is what he did to the abstract concept of truth, or to the integrity of the self-help industry. It's what he did to actual human beings. Florence Elizabeth Horner was 18 years old when she married him. A teenager from a wealthy family who believed in his potential. She gave him 25 years of her life, bore 3 children, and watched her family's money disappear into his endless failed schemes while he abandoned her to chase opportunities in other cities. She raised their sons essentially alone, while Hill was out giving lectures on the importance of family and personal responsibility. Rosalie Beeland invested her money, her time, and her genuine belief in Hill's philosophy, helped him complete his most successful book, and received infidelity and abandonment in return. Even Annie Lou Norman, who stayed with him until the end, spent her final years caring for an increasingly ill man, who rebuilt his reputation on teachings he never successfully applied to his own life. These weren't abstract victims of fraud. They were real women with names and stories, who deserved better than to be erased from the narrative of a man they supported. The historical record is clear and extensively documented through court records, newspaper archives, business filings, and biographical research. Napoleon Hill was a con artist who stumbled into legitimate success by teaching other people how to succeed in ways he never could himself. He invented credentials, fabricated interviews, plagiarized ideas, and built an empire on lies. The question we should be asking isn't whether his teachings have value. Some of them clearly do, for some people, but whether we should be building our dreams on a foundation of fraud. Whether we should trust our aspirations to philosophies created by someone who demonstrated through his actions that he didn't believe his own teachings enough to live by them. This chapter of self-help history deserves to be remembered not as inspiration but as a warning. Question your gurus. Verify their sources. Understand that motivation without ethics is just manipulation with better marketing. And remember that the people selling you the secret to success are often the ones profiting most from your belief in shortcuts that don't exist.